Social justice means applying the law equally to all people, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. I'm John Gonzalez. I'm here with my former law partner, Jack DeRora. We practice law, we seek social justice. On this show, we reveal the conflict between the two.
You know, for a while, it was just us in the office over a cup of coffee talking about the news of the day. With social justice issues dominating our culture, our focus became, how do we as lawyers make a difference?
And now it's not just us. Today we have Marty Schladen on our show to talk about free press during the Trump administration. Marty has been an investigative reporter for decades and currently works for the Ohio Capitol Journal. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you.
Jack, I sometimes reflect back on law school, and I had a wonderful constitutional law professor, Brian Freeman. He's passed, but he used to tell us that the First Amendment does not treat reporters any different than average citizens as far as the protections and the rights that you have. Have you ever thought about that?
I haven't thought about it in that context, but I wonder what he would say about the First Amendment's protection of the press itself. I mean, there are two aspects to the First Amendment: the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press from suppression. I think the word suppress is in there somewhere.
Well, in what we learned in general was, you should have, in a perfect world, the right to express yourself without prior restraints.
Right.
But then if you do it, there are maybe some laws. I remember the people from Fire that came in, and we talked about the theater with yelling fire, and I think he said, well, as long as there's a fire, otherwise he thought it was okay to say whatever you want.
Sure.
I have a discussion with my brother all the time that he thinks any speech is good speech, even if it's untruthful speech.
Well, regrettably, Fire would agree with him, I think.
And I think the Supreme Court, to a large extent.
Sure.
But when we look at reporters, I think for the most part, at least the professionals, have a code of ethics that hopefully prevents them from making things up and reporting what they might think is an untruth. Maybe we should ask our resident expert about that. What type of guidelines are there for reporters?
Well, I'm fond of saying that really at bottom, journalism ethics are simple. If you just want to boil it way down, it's that you never, ever, ever knowingly print or publish something that you know is not true. If you stick to that, generally most of the rest of the stuff follows from that.
It seems to me that one of the broad issues in our society is that people that aren't trained as reporters or aren't in that profession with any oversight still have access to thousands, if not millions of people, and they can report or talk about things with really no guidelines and no restrictions on them. And it's hard to decipher through that to me.
Well, and I don't know if you're familiar with Beth Macy. She's from Ohio, from Urbana. She wrote Dope Sick. Her latest book is a semi-memoir called Paper Girl. But one of the very important themes in that book is the demise of local journalism and, really mainstream newspapers generally. And it's created a vacuum that this fog machine you're referring to has filled. We're hardwired to want to hear stories about each other, and people are going to get those somewhere. And if people aren't at least trying to be intellectually honest, you're going to get a lot of garbage.
I love that phrase, fog machine. So let me get this straight. Unlike lawyers who have several pages of ethical guidelines that determine what our obligations are, that of a reporter is pretty simple. Don't knowingly publish something that's false. But I guess the problem is who's a reporter and who's not a reporter. Am I right?
Well, that goes to this whole question that you're talking about at the top of the podcast. The First Amendment doesn't confer any special rights on the press because if it did, it would put the government in a position of deciding who is and is not a journalist, when we can't have that. You just have to, there has to be this honor system. There has to be this idea of intellectual honesty. And, I think some people are just dishonest people. They've got an agenda, whatever. And then others just have no clue the space they're stepping into.
And I think
there's no regulatory body on top of that, right?
And you can't have one, right?
Right. Just like you were saying, it's not free speech then if somebody's regulating it. Jon Stewart, who I love to listen to his podcast, talks about, it's more difficult now to sift through what's true or false or misleading and not. And a lot of people just either don't have the time or just are too lazy to do it. And that's, an issue of our democracy. And I think about that. What advice would you have to somebody that reads something in their internet feed but doesn't know whether to believe it or not? What's the next step?
I really think this should be taught, should have been taught in the public schools going back to the advent of the internet at least. I encourage people to look at information they see on the internet the way we do. As soon as I see some sort of a claim, my first question is, who said that? Where is this coming from? And often, outfits, I've never heard of them before. So then before I, assume one thing about it being true or false, I've got to figure that out. And sometimes if it's especially an extraordinary claim, you may want to corroborate it from another source. There's this old saying I learned way back when I first started as a reporter. That's like the Scientific Union or some group like that put it out. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and very often when people are making some extraordinary claim to you, some conspiracy theory or whatever, not only do they not offer extraordinary proof, they offer no proof.
I've phrased that a little differently. I mean, I like the way you phrased it, but my thought, the way I've captured it is, if it seems alarming, you got to double check it.
Absolutely. And just because something could plausibly be true does not make it so. You guys know that as lawyers better than I do. You gotta go into court and prove whatever you're claiming. You can't just pull it out of thin air.
You can't, but one of the things that lawyers struggle with, at least I hope they do, is when you have a witness that is the only one that can give testimony on an issue, and you got to decide first if you believe them, but more importantly, if a judge or a jury is going to believe them, because let's face it, good liars are believable. I mean, con men and women that are good at it, right, are successful in a large extent. So we're always struggling with that as to, what's this jury going to think about this witness? But we do what you said, Marty, with as far as what reporters look at. What's their background? What's their reason for knowing? What's their motivation? There's a lot of questions that go into that credibility. I see that you're an investigative reporter, and this may be a very basic question, but is that a subcategory of the general reporters? Is it or a broader category?
Well, so I sometimes get uncomfortable with it because it sounds pretty pretentious. But in my mind, it means that you're willing to dig, especially when some person in a position of power kind of pats you on the head and says, there's nothing to see here, or this is too complicated for you to understand. You keep going. What I've been really interested in the last several years, when I was at the Dispatch, we started on this lengthy project about pharmacy benefit managers that's still not over.
Hold on for a second. That takes a repeat. It's been in the news for years, and it still hasn't been solved. What's that say about Ohio?
Well, that's a national thing, and it has to do with these three giant healthcare conglomerates engaging in what many call anti-competitive practices. And there's a lot of money there. You're not going to turn that aircraft carrier around overnight. But the way we started on that story, and I mean, it's a brag, but we, the Dispatch, were, some of the journalistic, first ones to the party on that. And it was, again, they're these opaque, complicated relationships, and you just got to be willing to go through the boring stuff, and try to unravel what the business arrangement is.
That's the heavy lifting of reporting, I would think.
Yes.
And I remember that in Dispatch. The work was excellent, but it resulted in personal dismay. We can't solve this problem.
Well, I mean, they're even talking about it in Congress now, and there's a lot of reforms have been undertaken. The Federal Trade Commission was doing a lot in the pharmacy benefit manager space, but then when Donald Trump took office, he tried to remove the two Democrats from the FTC, and that work on PBMs has been stymied for now anyway.
I was going to ask you about something I had heard some panel talking about investigative reporters, and the comment was they shine a light on government action. But what you're really talking about is broader than that. It's not just government action, it's powerful people's action, or however you want to phrase it, which kind of brings us to more of the topic we wanted to explore with you a little bit is these private people or private companies. There must be a lot of barriers to getting information from them. I got to imagine because in our civil lawsuits, we've got subpoena power, we've got depositions and discovery, but without that, they could close off the information. And then there's probably a difference with government and how it has an ability to close off information. Can you start with these private companies? How do you gather or investigate, an issue that pops up?
Well, I've only done one tour of duty on the business desk. I was covering manufacturing for the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette as the markets melted down going into the Great Recession. And it can be very frustrating because, most of the information a business has, they can hold privately. You need their cooperation. Thank God for the SEC. They have to make filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you can learn a lot of stuff from that, including how much the top dog is paying him or herself. But it can, where most governments have to abide by the Freedom of Information Act or states' open records laws. So at least back in those good old days, they were legally bound, and I think a lot of times public officials felt honor-bound to follow the law and just give you what you're asking for, although it was also not infrequent that people would obstruct you.
Well, we hear about whistleblowers, and I think another thing like the anonymous sources, that sends a message to some people that there may not be any credibility because these people want to be anonymous. How much of what you do relies upon either the whistleblower or an anonymous source?
Well, a lot of the publications I've worked at had very strict policies about anonymous sources. I worked at the Galveston Daily News 2 different times, and it's known as this feisty small Texas paper. And I did a story where we used an anonymous source for the first time in the history of the paper. It's a discipline, right? You don't want, Bob Woodward will say, and Bob Woodward lives in a different world than I do, that, he couldn't function without anonymous sourcing. Mm-hmm. And I find that totally persuasive. But my boss, his policy was, we don't want people thinking we're just putting our feet up on our desk making this stuff up, So when we really, really, really had to use an anonymous source, we did.
And I think that the reporter's credibility has to lend some credibility to the anonymous source. So, I always want to know who the reporter is that's giving me this anonymous source because, if you can believe that reporter has credibility and honesty, then you're thinking, okay, they're not just throwing this up because who wants to ruin their career, over that? But when I look at anonymous sources and whistleblowers, it seems to me that with what the Trump administration is doing to restrict access to information, that's one of the few ways that reporters can get information. What do you think?
It's very disturbing. I think that the room for corruption to go undetected is, as high as it's been in a really long time. I think that it's pretty transparently clear that Donald Trump his concern is not the accuracy of the information being reported. His concern is being questioned, being covered critically, which, there's just no exception in the First Amendment for, the big cheese doesn't like what you're writing about him,
The big cheese. Everything we read in the paper in terms of suppression of speech or suppression of the press is taking place at the national level. And I want to explore that. But I'm not seeing as much in Ohio, or am I missing the headlines somewhere?
Well, I don't think it's the same extreme, but you are missing the headline a little bit. Governor DeWine is very open. He actually, during the pandemic, he faced the press twice a week, every week for a while, and then once a week, and I certainly felt free to ask any impertinent question I wanted. And, he made it clear he didn't always like those questions, but he'd show up the next time. Some of the other statewide Republicans, for example, Frank LaRose, and this isn't just LaRose. Because we've written critically about their offices, particularly the Secretary of State's office, they call us things like the Ohio Communist Journal, it's a way to try to delegitimize us, and Frank has refused, during a press gaggle, refused to take questions from me and run away. And so there, and to me, that's just sort of a breach of a fundamental duty in an open society to stand and, deal with the press, even if you don't like it,
LaRose lost credibility with me when what's the right word? When he corrupted the language on the amendment for redistricting. And then later on, he criticizes the uproar over the redistricting of Ohio. Here's a guy that did something that I think was ethically and morally wrong.
When he's blatantly contradicted himself over and over, when he tried to make it nearly impossible for citizens to initiate constitutional amendments, he said it wasn't about abortion. And then, a couple of days later, he's speaking, I think, to a party group, or Brian Stewart was, and saying that's definitely what it's about. Over and over, he's tried to have it both ways, saying that, he's run secure elections in Ohio, but we keep having to make it harder to vote to keep, elections secure. And, he's never shown any more than like 0.0001% of votes could possibly have been fraudulently cast. So he's tried to have it both ways on a lot of different things, and then he doesn't like it when we write about that.
I always comment to Jack that, to me, he's just auditioning for a bigger role. And, a lot of those positions, when I look at them, are designed to attract the interest of a group, if we want to call them the MAGA people or the Trump people, because it just seems targeted to that. I remember talking to a couple of lobbyists years ago at a function, and I asked them, how do they handle the press, or how do they talk to their clients about handling press? And they said, you want to answer all the questions, but really not. What you want to do is just state your position. Whatever the question is, you go back to your position. And I told him, I said, well, from a person that's just watching this, it seems to be ridiculous. You get a question from the press, and they're not always great questions. Then you get an answer that doesn't really address it, and they're addressing what they want. And then there's another question, and it's like, why go through this?
It's pointless.
It does seem to be pointless. They're asking questions of the press secretary for President Trump, and she just stating the same stuff of how great everything is, and not even, all they're asking about is a patch on his hand.
Right.
Oh, there was a time in my career where I'd have given my left arm to be in that room. Now I would rather do almost anything else because it just seems like Caroline Leavitt's going to get frustrated, the press corps is going to get frustrated, and nobody's going to get any good out of the whole exercise,
I was looking on the internet for restrictions that the Trump administration, and I came across this, and I think I'd heard of it, but I haven't followed up, so maybe Marty has, but he's got the Media Hall of Shame on their website.
Oh, I didn't see that. You're kidding.
No, and what it says is it's the Trump considers certain media outlets and journalists, they're spreading biased information, so they're on the have you seen that? Have you looked at that?
I haven't looked at it, but I heard about it, and I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. If the president thinks that that's going to upset the members of the press corps who make that list, he's sorely mistaken. It's just like Richard Nixon's enemies list. The way I understand it, the reporters who ended up on that list were pretty proud.
That's a badge of honor in reality.
Yeah.
It was interesting. One of the reporters, I think she was from ABC, said, well, you and Hegseth were talking about releasing the video because a couple days prior, Trump said he'd release the video. So now she's saying, well, you and Hegseth talked about releasing it. And Trump says, I didn't say that. It was just remarkable.
Well, and he obviously says whatever he thinks is convenient to say in the moment, and whether it's true is not really his top consideration. And it's our job to say no, that's not what you said. That's just our job, and he does not like that.
Well, are there other examples? Are there any similar examples besides LaRose that you've encountered in Ohio? And we're not necessarily looking for names, although why not? But what challenges do you face that are similar?
Well, it's rare. It happens sometimes, but it's rare that our U.S. Senate offices respond to questions. And they seem to not understand that if they respond, I'm going to have to address their responses in my story. I have a duty to try to reflect what they're trying to say, and, every once in a while, Dave Yost will get on the phone with me to talk about something. It's been a little while now, but, he's done a lot of stuff in the pharmacy benefit manager world. He used to be a reporter himself, and, he'll tell you because he knows the game. If he actually gives me an interview, he's always going to get a better story for himself because he's told me what he thinks. I have to put it in the story,
I was thinking about Trump with his personal attacks, and I have yet to read about or see one that involves somebody other than a woman. And maybe he's personally attacking male journalists, but they're not.
Those don't make the news.
Maybe not, or maybe it's just not happening. But has that ever happened to you or a colleague where, whoever you were interviewing, with that kind of power, lashed out?
Oh, yeah.
Is that a badge of honor, too, or is that more, hey, whoa?
It is, but in the moment, it can really suck.
Yeah, I think there's an understatement. It can really suck.
Well, when I was in El Paso, we had a local attorney who was a real ball of fire, and she there was basically her law license was in trouble. Her partner's law license was in trouble. It was a disciplinary hearing. When I went to El Paso, I've been not in court as much as you guys, but I've been in court a lot. And I'd watched this woman. Her name was Teresa Caballero. And the El Paso judges were letting her get away with stuff. I'm like, how in the world is this happening? She'd just take over the hearing and it would be like bonkers. So this was Stewart's disciplinary case. And Teresa in open court brought me up over and over and over because of my coverage of the thing. And when you're sitting in court trying to cover a proceeding and someone's calling you out like that, it's tough. You know, you gotta saying all this untrue stuff, calling all these names, acting like I'm Genghis Khan or somebody, and you just got to sit there with your notebook and keep your mouth shut.
So I tell you, I like Jon Stewart. So he had the clip of Trump on Air Force One talking to the reporters, and it was two female reporters that were kind of in the frame of the camera, and he had said something like, "You're stupid," and then "So are you." And they turned in Stewart froze on their faces, which you could just see that, to me, both of them wanted to say something, right? Like, I had a professor once said the perfect response would be, "You, sir, are an ass." He said that to a student once. I thought, what a great response. But anyway, I wonder if anybody's ever on a hot mic or whatever they call it after Trump says something like that, just really saying what they think, because there must be some respect for the office that these reporters don't give it back in kind.
Well, it's a rookie move to give it back. It's just like, keeping your cool in court. I mean, the one glittering advantage is I'm the one writing the story. I automatically get the last word, So why would I get in some big personal thing where, I'm going to say stuff I regret, everything's being recorded. There's no point in it.
Yeah, it might satisfy your ego at the moment, but no, I understand, and I would think that it's better to let it go unsaid, because he just looks not very presidential. He looks petty, and you don't know who's advising him, and maybe nobody is, or maybe he just doesn't care, but it wouldn't take a very politically savvy person to say, "That's not working for you, Mr. President."
Well, it's pretty clear that he's not totally coachable. In fact, wasn't he just bragging about, he was supposed to be talking about affordability, and he did this 90-minute. I covered two of his campaign speeches in Pennsylvania this last go-round. And he obviously just gets up there and says whatever he wants. And he bragged about not reading a teleprompter when obviously his handlers were like, we need to talk to people about how we feel they're paying about, inflation and affordability.
Let's go back to some of the really big issues as I saw them at the national level. One being Trump precluding reporters from being part of the Pentagon staff unless they signed this pledge, which resulted finally in a lawsuit by the New York Times just a week or so ago. Okay, you're not a Pentagon reporter, but how does this strike you and your colleagues when you read about this? What do you say?
Well, it's completely outrageous. And then to make it even more outrageous is that Pete Hegseth actually drew a reporter's salary, and and I'm sure it was a lot bigger one than the one I'm drawing.
He didn't. He wasn't drawing a reporter's salary. He was drawing a commenter's salary,
an entertainer's salary,
an entertainer's salary. Yeah,
for what supposedly is a news organization. Right. But no, we live in a free society, and that means that obviously our top defense leaders need to have some secret spaces in which they can operate. But still, this is just another aspect of civilian control of the military. We've got decentralized power in this country. So, the president's a civilian, but in fact, one of the bad legacies of Vietnam was that, the next time we went to war, the Pentagon learned to embed reporters, not allow reporters to, go be among the troops the way, Ernie Pyle did during World War II. And I just think that's a real loss. The military is, accountable to the public, and we're the public's representatives. And when they're essentially asking us to sign a loyalty oath, it makes me wonder, is this Soviet Russia or what?
It was so bad that not even Fox News would sign the loyalty pledge. That's a marker of how bad it was.
Well, and if you look at the tactics, so we talked about the administration trying to shame reporters, the hall of shame, the insults and things like that. And I get what you're saying, Marty, that the reporters, it just, it's like water off a, what do they call it?
Duck's back.
Yeah. And so it's kind of like if you're in court and, the judge is giving you a hard time, well, you focus in on the jury and winning your case. And you don't really care what this judge is doing if you think it's improper. But that's another tactic. Instead of shaming somebody, they're going to restrict access to the information. And to me, that's worse. And so what was the one with the Gulf of Mexico?
The Associated Press? Apparently the AP standards, however they're written, precluded the AP from referring to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. So Trump said you're not allowed to be in the White House as part of the White House press staff. I think that's still going on.
I believe you're right. And just so you know, a little interesting journalism arcana here. The AP produces what's called the AP style book, and that's our Bible.
Right.
It's like, how do you abbreviate state names? You look at the style book. So the AP style book says Gulf of Mexico. And I think one of the things they were showing Donald Trump was you don't just get to walk along. I mean, here's a guy who doesn't even know proper capitalization or punctuation. He doesn't get to summarily change AP style for Gulf of Mexico. And in the long run, it's really bad to keep, especially a venerable news organization like AP out of the White House. But don't you think to the extent that the public pays any attention to this, they just see a temper tantrum,
Sure.
Well, it depends on what side of the aisle you're looking on, or you're looking at, I should say.
Well, I don't know how many like a Republican electeds you guys know. There is a consciousness. I've spoken to people myself in this world that this is just bad behavior that they don't know how to control.
Let's go back to the First Amendment for a second, and I referred to this at the start, but I don't know if people really think about the breadth of the First Amendment. We think about it in terms, the common thought is freedom of speech. But it also says that Congress shall make no law, blah, 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 abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's pretty significant. Now, when you think about it, here are these fellows in 1780 or so thinking about how important the press was. As I see it, that was a pretty enlightened and remarkable view well over, 250 years ago to think about. They must have been thinking the press is a check on the government. And so people should be up in arms, although I don't think they are, when Trump does these things.
First of all, you're absolutely right, and you have to think about the historical context in which the Constitution was hammered out. They were getting rid of a king, and they were tired of being treated like, nobodies with no political power of their own, and they saw that if you've got a free press, they were extremely suspicious of centralized power, and this was one check out of many. Unfortunately, with Donald Trump there's just so much all the time, and some of it is so over the top that I think for some people who pay a lot of attention, it's appalling. Like what he calls us the enemy of the American people. A free press. We're actually in the Constitution, like you just said. Other people, they're just trying to live their lives, and they think, okay, he says everything, whatever. And then there's another tranche of people who, are his hardcore partisans, and they think he's right.
Well, Trump's has, to me, an amazing ability to tap into, let's just say, a distrust. And I think there was a growing distrust of the media, and I know I'm using that term very broadly. At times, the media, to me, can line up as conservatives and as liberals. It's like we talk, not just like the Supreme Court's a lot worse, but they line up as conservatives and liberals. And Trump taps into something like that and then makes it a huge thing. I always think about immigrants. Who's going to argue with Trump that the worst of the worst need to be deported if they're here illegally and they're committing bad crimes? That's, everybody's going to agree to it. But then he takes an issue like that and he turns people against all immigrants. To me, he did a similar thing with reporters. He tapped into this sense that reporters are out of control and they're biased. And I think both sides think that, right? We look at Fox News and, and we think they're biased, and they look at, April Maddow and CNN and they think they're biased. And it's just worked for him. And I think that because the media is such a big concept, it's hard for reporters like you to say, look, we're the credible part of it. Don't point at me at a rally and say I'm the problem, because I'm not. But I don't know, Marty, how you get back to the high ground at this point.
I think that it's not just for us, but I think this is important for our body politic generally. You have to have rational conversations with people who you may not agree with on everything, and start from a place of respect. I've got a lot of old friends who are Fox News watchers, that sort of thing, and when I start hearing that, how terrible the press is or whatever, I'm like, you realize I'm the press. Well, you're okay. But it just has to do with, I don't know how you scale it up, but it has to do with just, having a serious conversation with people about, what is it that we disagree about,
I don't think we're geared for that emotionally. I think, and I'm stealing a little of this from Sam Harris, getting to the truth is hard work. You got to read more than one source. You got to analyze. You have to think. And most people are spending just a lot of time working and putting food on the table. And so they latch onto something that's bright and right in their face, and it's accepted. So I think it's quite a march to elevate the conversation, because you're asking a lot of the average person who doesn't have the time and maybe not the capacity to really search out the truth. And that's on top of how we need leadership to be the guiding light, because right now they're not willing to be the guiding light. So in my view, it's a twofold problem.
Well, and the first part of it is definitely on us. And if you talk to any, print/online reporter, they'll tell you, and I'm sure this is true in broadcast too, we've got to write better. Every story you do, you're renting out space in somebody's mind. You've got to engage them, tell them why they care. Like I had one editor once, he said, our problem isn't that we write the long stories too long, we write the short stories too long. You've got to understand that you're imposing on people's time, so you've got to take them information and explain to them right off why they should give a crap about it,
That's the art of communication. Go ahead.
Well, but just like you said, Jack, and you think about this, you've got thousands of reporters that are doing their best ethically and professionally to present, your profession. But that's tough to make a dent. But then you have one man who gets his 3 or 4 seconds every night of a blurb, and the president can do a lot, right? And what he's chosen to do is mostly negative. But I was watching Kristi Noem at her hearings the other day, and they had these veterans propped up there and talking about, you deporting people that shouldn't be. And I just don't know why her or the president just doesn't say something like, yeah, that's wrong, we're going to fix that, right? Or I appreciate the press. I appreciate good press, professional press, reporters that are, he can still go and do the same thing, but he could actually prop up because he's got that power. And I just think he's misused it and abused it. And he's in such a unique position to make things a lot better.
He'll never do any better for this reason. He doesn't know how to do good. It's as simple as that. And he's surrounded by people who will carry his water for whatever advantage they seek. And that's the subject of a whole nother podcast.
Well, and it makes my thanks to Marty even more so because, I do appreciate you doing a job that's probably thankless most of the time, but you're shining a light on people that need it, and we appreciate it.
No thanks needed. It is the most. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's the most fun, interesting thing a person could do. It's pretty great.
Hey, before we sign off, let's talk about it. Have you been tracking this bill that would require libraries to go through their volumes and segregate things that have some reference to sexual orientation so they can be out of the reach of patrons less than 18 years old?
I've not been, but I find that very disturbing.
Well, I thought too, there's almost always, it seems, something about books and libraries and what should be accessible and what should not be accessible. And this was putting the onus on libraries to cull their books and segregate them so that kids under 18 couldn't access them. And then I was reading, the Secretary of State in Tennessee was doing the same thing. And I thought, boy, that's an interesting responsibility, for the Secretary of State to take that on. Same thing.
So I can tell you, my trick knee tells me that that's really bad politics. There are all these cracks forming in the Republican coalition as it is, and obviously the Rand Paul libertarian wing of the party doesn't want to hear about book banning. But also, libraries are super popular. Every, levy or renewal that happened in Ohio, the last time they were on the ballot, I guess it was a year ago, November, I think they all passed. And at the same time, like in these last November elections, all these Moms for Liberty book banners, they all had their heads handed to them. So, you want to make yourself less popular with voters, go do this.
I tried to invite representatives from Moms for Liberty to be here. I never got a yes.
That's too bad.
Oh, yeah, well, I wanted to just engage them in conversation and see what the process is. That's simple because, as you can tell, we don't harangue people. We just ask questions and converse, but I couldn't get anybody on the show. And as to libraries, I stopped buying books years ago. I can go into a library, and if they don't have it, they'll go somewhere and get it for me. It's just this wonderful resource. How can you not like your local library?
Well, I just want to tell your audience, too, and you guys, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you're doing some kind of genealogy research or any other kind of research, if you go to the main library and you go up to the third floor and talk to those people, they love it. They love helping you out, and they know their stuff. So there's what's not to like.
It's a great resource. Hey, Marty, I echo Gonzo's sentiments. It really was nice having you with us. And like Gonzo, I commend you for the great work that you do. So keep at it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it was fun. That's what we try to do all the time, is to make it enjoyable for our guests. Our thanks to WOSU and our sound engineer, Dalton Jones. If you like what you've heard today, tell a friend. We want this to be more than just about us. We want it to be about all of us. And if you have time, like us, follow us on our podcast, submit a review, help elevate our profile so that other podcast listeners can find us. We'll be back at the start of the new year with another social justice issue. Until then, happy holidays. So long.